Now, Mr. Kelleher and Mr. Kelly, Southwest Airlines is not on trial here. I want you to understand that. Your customer satisfaction rating is not on trial or in question. What is at stake in this hearing is the role of the FAA and the compliance with airworthiness directives. Now, at the very outset of all this disclosure, there was a statement, initial public statement from Southwest Airlines, implying that it had received concurrence from Boeing that it was acceptable to continue flying the aircraft. Those statements from Southwest, reported in the news media, copies of which we've received. Is it Boeing's responsibility to give approval on airworthiness directive matters, or is that the FAA's responsibility?
Mr. Chairman, I think there's been a mistake there with respect to what you read. We never asked the Boeing company to deal with the subject of regulatory compliance. We simply asked the Boeing company whether or not there were any safety of flight issues involved in flying those airplanes for the 8 days that it took to re-inspect them. The Boeing statement itself specifically says we are not addressing the issue of regulatory compliance.
Did they put that in writing to Southwest?
Gary, I believe it is.
Would you submit that for the record so we can have the record correct on that subject matter?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
It certainly gave a very inappropriate impression to my investigative mind, my experience.
Yes, I understand that. But they didn't opine on the regulatory aspect of it. They just said that they didn't think there was any threat to the safety of flight during those 8 days, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate your refreshing candor in saying we should not have flown.
Thank you, sir.
When we found those
we respect this committee and will always be candid with it.
And I also appreciate your reciting, which I did earlier during the events that led up to the aging aircraft legislation, the meeting out here at Crystal City with over 400 aviation safety professionals from around the world that actually resulted in the legislation and the airworthiness directive that took FAA an inordinately long time to publish. Now, I don't want to be nitpicking, but it bothers me to hear someone of your caliber to say it was a tiny part of the aircraft. It was a tiny part of that Aloha 737 that began to unravel. It always starts with a tiny part. And that is why airworthiness directives are issued, and that is why there is a requirement for rigorous inspection. And I stipulated at the outset that this Aloha aircraft was one that had 89,000 cycles. I should have gone further, which I do in other contexts, and point out that that aircraft had flown over the continental United States for most of its lifetime. And then it was, for a few years, put in service with Aloha over salt air, in a salt air environment. And as we know, those of us who follow these matters, that when an aircraft is pressurized, the skin expands microscopically. And moisture is taken out of the interior of the aircraft. and condenses around the hull and drains around the side. With the 727, is by the time it reaches altitude, it's drained 120 gallons of moisture out of the interior of the aircraft. And it drains out of weep holes, but not all of it drains out. And when it lands and it's decompressed, some of that moisture remains. And in the case of the Aloha, some of that moisture, water that had an electrolytic action with the aluminum copper skin of the aircraft that proved to be fatal. And it's secondly true that Boeing abandoned the cold bond method of manufacturing aircraft hull for much more stable and reliable. But the point was that what should not have happened, what was designed not to happen, but had never happened before, did happen. The same with the PCU, the power control unit, and the rudder. It should not have happened. Boeing came into my office in the aftermath of Aliquippa and said, we've flown 93 million hours of 737s, and this has never happened before. But it had. The NTSB, God bless them, went back after Aliquippa to look at previous incidents, command and rudder, and that had, for which they had not found a probable cause, and attributed to the failure of the PCU that caused an uncommanded rudder movement, and that corresponded with other similar incidents reported by pilots en route that raised concerns about the PCU, and Boeing then went back and re-engineered, did an enormous amount of work, and Southwest, I know, was engaged in that practice. I go to this extent to say these airworthiness directives have very significant weight. And that it is not acceptable. It's not acceptable with an FAA regulatory proceeding to fly beyond the airworthiness directive mandatory inspection time.
It is certainly not, Mr. Chairman, and everything that you've said is 100% right, and I don't disagree with anything that you've said. And your knowledge is really all-encompassing regarding this matter. When I said a tiny part, I didn't mean to demean the significance of it. That comment was made in the context of 1,100 pages covering 6 ADs and the failure of the engineering order to cover that tiny part of the airplane. What I was saying was not that any airplane part is insignificant. I didn't mean to convey that. But what I meant was out of the whole airplane with 1,100 pages and 6 ADs, the engineer missed a small part.
Yes, I understand that, and there is some traffic in the on the websites by various skeptics saying, oh, there are way too many airworthiness directives, they're way too complex, way too many pages for us. Well, if there are, then you better find something else to do, because at 35,000 feet in the air, there's no curb to pull over, look under the hood, and find out what's wrong. You have to do it right, and that's why there's redundancy built into aviation. You understand it. You have a safety mindset. I appreciate that.
Yes, sir. And what I was suggesting, again, that's not an excuse.
Good.
It's not an excuse. I was just saying I can understand how an engineer would miss a tiny part of the airplane in the midst of all this hullabaloo. And if my recollection is correct, Mr. Chairman, yesterday, Administrator Stargell said himself during his press conference that some of these ADs maybe need to be simplified so that they're crisper and easier to understand. Again, that's not an excuse, but it would, making them plainer and simpler and unified would facilitate, I think, understanding them.
Well, I'd be look with a very skeptical eye on any simplification they will do. But what is the status of the Southwest employees you announced have been placed on administrative leave? Mr. Kelly?
They are at home. They are on leave. They're being paid pending our
Not at
investigation.
work. They're not at a desk.
They are not. And, of course, our investigation is weeks old at this point, so we're not complete yet. But, yes, they're on leave.
Thank you. Mr. Petri.